Hey guys, it's Charles. It's Charles on Ned's World. Listen, we gonna check out this book called Destruction of Black Civilization by Chandler Williamson. Chan Williams, not Williamson, by Chandler Williams. Um, the great issues of race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD. So we're gonna get into it. Chapter one. Hit the thumbs up button. Subscribe to Charles on Ned's World. Appreciate it, guys. Let's check it out.
The land of the blacks was a vast land, a big world into itself covering 12 million square miles. From its northernmost point in what is now Tunisia to Cape Achilles is approximately 5,000 miles, and in its widest extent from east to west is 4,600 miles. The whole of this second largest continent was once Bilad as Sudan, the land of the blacks, and not just the southern region to which they had been steadily pushed from the north. After Asian, Greek, and Roman occupations, the term Sudan came to indicate the areas not yet taken from the blacks and was coextensive with the Ethiopian Empire. For the Ethiopian Empire once extended from the Mediterranean north and southward to the source of the Nile in the country, Abyssinia, which recently reverted to the ancient name of the Ethiopian Empire, of which in earlier times it formed its southeastern provinces. Even as late as the times of Menes, 3100 BC, Ethiopia still included 3/4 of Egypt, or up to 29 degrees north parallel. The Asians held the Delta region, hence the two lands, well known to all historians but never fully explained. To explain the two lands, of course, would blast the myth about the builders of Egyptian civilization. It was pointed out that the study of the blacks must begin in Egypt because more of their indestructible monuments are there, and, further, because many of the artifacts archaeologists have been uncovering during the past 75 years as Egyptian are in fact African. Yet the very heartland of the race and the cradle of civilization were actually further southward below the First Cataract, centered around the capital cities of Napata and Meroe. From there, black civilization spread northward, reaching its most spectacular achievements in what became known as Egyptian civilization. The general condition of vast stretches of land over the continent, uninhabited and uninhabitable, seemed to support the Western thesis that Africans never developed any worthwhile civilization, had no notable historic past, and, the more charitable might add, that in the very nature of their situation it could not be otherwise. Samuel Baker went far in promoting the idea of African innate inferiority, even if he had to use the most forbidding area in Africa to do it, the terrible swamplands of the Sud, an area south of Katorum that in its full extent is as big as England. No one would claim that any kind of society, civilized or savage, could exist in the Sud swamplands, probably the largest in the world. For it was neither land nor water, but a seemingly endless mass of rotting vegetation, interwoven tree-like vines, steaming heat, swarming man-killing mosquitoes, crocodiles, hippos, and other unknown forms of tropical life. The conclusion of Baker and others was that they were in a land where time had stood still since its beginning, where life never advanced and the human species has simply rotated in aimless cycles like the animal life in the Sud.
Wow.
As late as the 1840s and 50s, these explorers, even the most ignorant, should have known that in the same vast continent of wastelands, tropical rainforests, and swamplands, there were also areas of arable land and civilized states. But they wrote about what they saw the most of: vast stretches of wasteland and secluded groups of strange people. But as we shall see, some of the great kingdoms and empire builders in Africa seem not to have known the meaning of failure, or had any ideas about surrendering to fate.
That's right.
Ejected here, they led the people there, and began to build again. Wherever the splintered-off refugee groups found a place where the soil seemed favorable for cultivation, and the land unoccupied by preceding immigrants, they settled and began to build villages again. A sense of relative security was a necessary factor in deciding to begin a new settlement. A crucial question was, how many miles had they put between the slave hunters and themselves? For the kind of houses and community buildings they would erect depended directly on the probability of permanent settlement or sudden flight again. In short, whether to build large, sturdy, and attractive compound homes and temples of worship, or easily demolished huts. It was for reasons of security that so many of these groups, later called tribes or societies, sought the most hidden and isolated areas they could find. This permanent separation from their kinsmen in other groups was generally quite contrary to their heart's desires. The original splintering off and parting was often in tears. But breaking up into smaller units seemed to be the only route for survival in a permanent crisis situation. Apparently permanent, since the movement of people over the continent had been going on so far beyond the memory of each generation that migrations and temporary settlements were among the most significant facts in the oral tradition of each society. Fragmentation and isolation had two momentous consequences. The first was that the isolation of various groups led to the development of over 2,000 different dialects and languages. The second fateful outcome was that the rise of all these tongues widened the gulf between the blacks that territorial distances had already achieved. One should pause here for reflection if there is any serious attempt to really understand what happened to the African people and why. For even without the aid of Western writers in emphasizing the language differences and the cultural variations and attempting to show how unrelated the blacks are, they themselves came, in time, to consider themselves unique and each society not only independent of the other, but its enemy, if only potentially. Disunity and mutual suspicion became an African way of life. Small chiefdoms sprang up everywhere, often no more than a single village of 100 or 200 people. Africa, therefore, presented itself to Asia and Europe as the ideal land for exploitation, enslavement, and conquest. The history is complex and many-sided, and would be so if we were discussing just one nation and not an entire continent. This is why our focus must be on the main lines of development, the African-wide aspects, and the unmistakable common origin and continent-wide sameness of basic institutions which these universal aspects reflect. There were then different outcomes for different societies. Some perished even to the last member from disease, starvation, or warfare. Others, despairing of ever again being able to have a fixed abode, became nomads. Some, although isolated so long that they had developed different languages and customs, had nevertheless decided that salvation required a union with other groups. These were the tribes that merged with other tribes, lost their separate identity and languages, and who evolved from this process a single common language, larger and large chiefdoms, kingdoms, and finally empires that began the rebirth of their long-lost civilization. The fiercest wars between the blacks occurred in the founding and expansion of new kingdoms and empires. For while the core groups were voluntary confederations, expansion of empire required the conquest of neighboring states, usually small, independent chiefdoms that preferred to maintain their absolute sovereignty. The repercussions of this forced unity by conquests were to shake the continent from end to end centuries later when European political rule ended. Modern Africans and students of Africa have tended to emphasize the destructive impact of European imperialism in Africa, while ignoring the most damaging developments from the Arab impact before the general European takeover in the last quarter of the 19th century, a relatively recent period. This point is important, for one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the blacks is that dealing with those dauntless leaders and people who, having lost one state after another along with 3/4 of their kinsmen, nevertheless overrode all the forces of destruction and death and began to build, always once again, still another state. From the earliest times, the elimination of these states as independent African sovereignties had been an Asian objective, stepped up by Muslim onslaughts after the 7th century AD. So the re-established black states were still being conquered and Islamized when Europeans began to arrive in greater numbers to impose their rule over both Asians and Africans. The big thing that happened here, to repeat, is generally glossed over, ignored, or forgotten. The last being a pretension, since a historical development of this magnitude could hardly be forgotten by serious writers on Africa. For what happened very simply was that European imperialism in Africa checked and replaced Arab imperialism. The Arab screams against Western imperialism are the screams of outrage against Western Caucasians for checking and subduing Eastern Caucasians in the very midst of the blacks they had conquered. There are still countless of blacks who are naive enough to believe that the Arabs' bitter attack on Western colonialism show their common cause with Black Africa. Insofar as those who were fortunate enough to find promising areas for settlement are concerned, the picture was generally one of state building and the revival of basic African institutions which, though not forgotten, could neither be maintained nor developed by any people forever on the move. But what about the countless societies, fleeing before the conquering hordes and the enslavers, as well as the famine and deaths which were its daily companion? What about those who found no promised land anywhere? For quite unlike the societies I mentioned that could settle down and had the opportunity to start and develop civilizations comparable to any elsewhere in the world at the time, these people could neither settle down nor, therefore, develop a civilization. What they suffered from year to year as they wandered over the continent is almost beyond both description and belief. In fact, while the story is well known, few writers would want to go into its awful details. Suffice to say at this point that here now were numerous societies of Africans that were virtually sentenced either to death from starvation or enslavement by Arabs, and I am still in the pre-European period, or barbarism and savagery, and in many cases even cannibalism. Under such conditions, I would
Mm.
defend not only the
Cannibalism?
retrogression of these people to barbarism, but to cannibalism itself.
Wow.
The defense of the latter is easy, since it has been well established that other supposedly highly civilized men will revert to savagery and cannibalism under prolonged conditions of extreme hunger and thirst, when survival itself is the only question that dominates the hunger-crazed mind. This phenomenon of reverting to a state of savagery, and even cannibalism under extreme conditions of starvation, is known to occur universally among various peoples, white, black, brown, red, or yellow.
That's crazy.
The facts we have, then,
Oof.
show that after they lost Egypt and the eastern Sudan, some Africans, overriding all adverse conditions, grouped themselves to form nations and
Wow.
developed a high order of civilization independent of any external influences. Others never settled anywhere long enough to develop anything notable, but seemed to remain in a state of lethargy or suspended animation. They had surrendered to fate and became too weak to fight back. They descended to a state of semi-barbarism. Descended because most of these societies had known better times and a higher order of life. Some, in more favorable circumstances, nevertheless failed to advance. Still, others were in the class discussed in connection with cannibalism, hunger-crazed people who had sunk to the lowest levels of dog-eat-dog existence.
Mm, mm, mm.
These last are the people about whom European and American authors delight to write. No cartoons are better than those showing a sweating white man, usually an explorer or missionary, being cooked in a huge black pot, while black savages dance around with human bones decorating their heads or stuck through pierced noses. The idea these experts on Africa have been planting in the minds of the peoples of the world, and are still actively planting,
Media.
is that this is Africa, and these are the savages who are now clamoring for independence.
That is exactly true, man. Media is through their media. You know, CNN and NBC, CBS, multi-million-dollar media companies. Uh, YouTube. You know, um, Sony Pictures, Columbia Pictures, Warner Brothers, Fox, 20th Century Fox, uh, all these studios. You know, they can control the image. You know, the music industry. You know, Capitol Records, Universal Records. You know, all these record labels that are pretty much owned by people that are not of color. They're white people that own it. And the thing about it I've learned is, I remember Malcolm X got a quote said. He said that media is the most powerful entity on the planet. It can make the guilty look innocent and make the innocent look guilty. That's the truth, man. So he always talked about controlling his, media. You know what? I never really got into Malcolm X until later on, like later in my life. Like even when I was like in my 20s, I never really been into him. I mean, of course, I saw the movie when I was a teenager back in the day, but I never really started following and listening to his stuff until I got maybe like in my 30s. I started getting into like a lot of I was like, it's on YouTube. They got a couple of clips here and there, and listening to him, I was like, wow, he knew this stuff like in the 60s. Like, damn. But so anyway, what do y'all think about this book, The Destruction of BLK Civilization by Chandler Williams? Check it out on Audible and hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to Charles. Appreciate it.